Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Fridays with Fintelekt session, which we've titled The Impact of Changing Supply Chain Structures on AML CFT Compliance. Now, many of you will know that we took a slight break from Fridays with Fintelekt for the past few months. And with this episode, we're now kicking off the next season. So thank you for joining the conversation today, where we will talk about the changing structure of supply chains due to various geopolitical incidents, how these changes are affecting global trade, the consequence on the money laundering and terrorist financing risks, and therefore how regulators, banks, and financial institutions and others should prepare. So the idea for today's episode actually came to me when I met Mark in Singapore last month, and he showed me this white paper that he had published, and it's called Supply Chains and the Multiverse of Risk. And then I also asked Lakshmi if she would be sort of kind enough to join us in this conversation, and she agreed. So here we are. Now, for those of you who I haven't met before, my name is Shirish, Pathak. I head Fintelekt, and it is a pleasure for me to host these two esteemed professionals from the risk and compliance area today, namely Lakshmi Kumar, Director of Policy at Global Financial Integrity, who's joining us from Washington, and Mark Nuttall, Director of Risk for APAC and MENA at Thomson Reuters, Singapore, but who's today joining us from Australia. So, Lakshmi and Mark, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Shirish. It's a pleasure.
Thank you so much, Shirish.
So before we begin the session and get into the questions, Lakshmi and Mark, I mean, I know you are very well known and respected in the financial crime compliance industry globally, but may I just request you to say a few words about yourselves so that the audience gets to know you a bit better. So Lakshmi, maybe you can start off.
I'm very happy to do so. Thank you for everyone that's joined today. My name is Lakshmi Kumar. I'm the Policy Director at Global Financial Integrity. Our work really, we looked to see the movement of illicit finance between the financial and trade system and what the costs and consequences and impacts are. And we work with government, civil society, private sector. Our work is often concentrated in the US, large parts of Latin America, and in Africa, and occasionally we do some work in the Asian context. But it is the ability we do I would say we produce research products, we help draft legislation in many countries. We also help support advocacy efforts to raise the profile of issues to do with illicit finance and trade, including trade-based money laundering and other anti-money laundering efforts. And it's a pleasure to be here today.
Thanks, Lakshmi. Mark, something about you? And I have to say, I really like that shirt.
Thank you so much, Shirish. You said it was a casual day, so I've gone casual. There we go.
Thank God it's Fridays with Fintelekt.
Yeah, exactly. And thank you very, very much for having me. For those of you that know me, I'm usually dressed in a shirt and tie and a suit. Today I've gone cash, and that's no disrespect to everybody. It's because it's Friday, and it's Fridays with Fintelekt. So that's the reason why I'm like this. Plus, I've just jumped off a plane from Singapore, so it's been a very adventurous evening. Yes, I'm Mark Nuttall. I was a detective at New Scotland Yard for a number of years. I dealt with traditional recidivist crime, all the way from drug importation, exportation, firearm importation, exportation, money laundering, financial crime of every means possible, big, complex networks involving shell companies, recidivists, shelf companies, more importantly, on a global basis, utilising the 24-hour clock when they needed to back in those days. Obviously, it's a bit different these days. I've owned businesses, so I know what it's like to be involved in the supply chain. I've been corporate in nature as well. I've worked for corporate entities. I've worked at second line of defence within a financial institution. I've had pocket powers in the UK, confiscator, restraints, etc. I was in Interpol as well for a number of years, working all around the ASEAN Asia region as well as Europe. That tied into the supply chain market for natural resource goods, so forestry items, wildlife items, etc., etc. and looking at the complex nature of organisations that utilise and have set those organisations up for, you know, over 70 to 100 years, really complex matters, as well as understanding various legislation in various jurisdictions, because obviously a crime's not a crime, dependent on where you are and what you're doing. And it's the same with the police. The police are not the police, depending on which country you're in, what their functions are, what they may do. And it's the same with prosecutors, lawyers. We all need to start realising as well that supply chains might look the same and business might look the same globally, but actually law enforcement, prosecution, governance doesn't look the same at all from region to country to even within a country itself. Thomson Reuters, yes, I'm at Thomson Reuters at the moment, and I'm leading within the region their capacity for special services, which is essentially answering a question from a client. I can get into that in more depth at some other point, but this is not sales speech. This is a discussion about supply chains and money laundering. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Lakshmi, for those intros. Now, audience, as we go through the session, if you have any questions for Lakshmi and Mark, please feel free to post them in the Q&A box, and I will pick it up either during the session or you know, at the end, depending on what the question is. So, Lakshmi, let me start off the discussion with you. So, you know, as we know, supply chains all over the world have actually been in a state of flux since the start of the pandemic, right? And now also a variety of geopolitical causes have added to this complexity. Now, some of these causes could be pandemic related, logistic disruptions or production delays, shortages, could be the you know, Russia-Ukraine war, could be rising commodity prices, not just because of the war, but maybe a likely slowdown in China. It could be labor market shortages, you know, partly due to the pandemic. These days, some countries are also employing some protectionist sort of strategies. And post-pandemic, or as we get out of it, we also see a sudden rise in demand for certain products, let's say cars, for example, at least here. So what would you say has been the impact of these factors on the overall global trade and on trade finance? And you know, what is the nature of this impact? Do you think it's a short-term impact, or you know, are we likely to see longer-term consequences? Lakshmi, you're on mute.
No, I just realized I'm on mute. You think like 3 years into this pandemic, I have figured the mute button out, but not. So apologies for that. But no, that's a great question. And I think there are, I would just add a couple of other factors to what you've already mentioned is the impact of climate change. You know, some of these factors seemingly feel like short-term factors, but what we are seeing with the experience of climate change around supply chain is both present, and it will be a long-term problem that institutions will have to contend with. You know, for instance, in recent months, you know, with China's, in this year, the China's Yangtze River, which was, you know, which is responsible for about 45% of the country's economic output, was closed because water levels were 50% below normal. Also this year, we've seen massive droughts. You know, 2/3 of Europe had severe drought conditions, which is only expected to worsen in the coming years. There were heat waves, you know, which made headline news in the UK. The US has also had severe drought conditions. Now, the reality is, yes, you can move those supply chain routes to trucks, but for every ship that has to be replaced, you need 500 trucks to replace that. So that's clear evidence of what you really see as long-term consequences that you're also going to have to think about. Now, in the short term, you know, some of the short-term stuff, you know, at this point, I think there's a recognition that it is no longer short-term. For instance, you know, the problems, ongoing geopolitical tensions between Russia and Ukraine, and as a consequence, you know, tensions between US and China, which in this case, you know, during when Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan, it for momentarily affected one of the busiest shipping zones, and it did, you know, long term, there will be concerns about how it affects semiconductor delivery, At the same time, you see, again, as a consequence of geopolitical tensions between the US and China, the supply chains for cobalt are particularly interesting because, China, through investments in Africa and all over Latin America, now controls, not only is the premier destination, and in many cases, over 50% of all mineral refining for a lot of key rare earth metals and other metals necessary for infrastructure development. The refining of that is done in China. At the same time, the majority of the mines are also in those countries, both in Latin America and in Africa, owned by China. And in the US, at least, that's meant that it raises the questions about, I think from a US side, about forced labor, corruption, money laundering, and therefore it puts a certain amount of burden on US companies in terms of how they are looking at supply chains, but it's also the cascading of the knock-on effect of that has been greater investment in domestic industries and domestic research. And one of the things we saw immediately in the aftermath of the pandemic is, as a consequence of both the pandemic, but also geopolitical tensions that have not gotten better since the pandemic, is this rush to find alternate supply chains. And what I will say is that the impact has been that, you've seen countries like Vietnam suddenly flooded with offers that they more that they can handle. But in other places, it's meant that the ability to sort of police has never really changed, because while we have seen these stress factors impact the industry, both private sector and government have never really had the tools or the architecture to deal with the problem. So the stresses don't actually make things better. Like in many countries where I work, we've seen as a product of this, because of the pandemic, there's immediately meant, lowered presence of personnel in countries where there are, to begin with, porous borders. Or in other cases, you've seen sort of increase in corruption. But I'm happy to sort of talk a little bit more about that. But I think it's complex. And the last thing I will add is that just in terms of the ability of institutions to keep up. Mark clearly is the expert, and I wanted to quote a Thomson Reuters stat here, so I will do that. But acknowledging that this is really Mark's field of expertise, which is from Thomson Reuters, we've seen data which essentially says that during the first 5 weeks of the conflict in Ukraine, they produced 13,370 listings. Just from February 2022 until April 2022. That was 393 updates today. And that was over 256 regulatory changes. And so the ability of institutions to actually keep up, and I think you have to sort of fully acknowledge that depending on where you are, depending on the institution you are, depending on the personnel you are, you're not going to keep that up. And, this is fresh off the press, but ICICI Bank, one of the leading financial institutions in India, just settled with the US Treasury because they admitted the US Treasury alleged that they had little to no AML controls. And so, when you see something like that happen, it really brings to mind where the focus on something like supply chain and trade issues and anti-money laundering risk programs will be in the priority list for financial institutions. But yes, thank you for the question. But if there are further clarifications, happy to talk more about this.
Fantastic. Thanks, Lakshmi, for that response. So, Mark, coming to you now. ESG standards are adding another layer of complexity to these global supply chains, right? And I mentioned when we started this session that you published this paper. Let me show it again for the people who've joined after that. This is a paper published by Mark, which is on supply chains and the multiverse of risks. So, Mark, can you give the audience a quick summary of the paper and especially the impact of heightened ESG regulations on compliance?
Let me come off mute. Like all of us, it's forever a problem, isn't it? Lakshmi weighed things up there because when you're looking at the supply chain, people tend to forget that they're involved in the supply chain in full. Everybody's part of the supply chain. We're all consumers, every single one of us, in some way, shape, or form. Even if you're a prisoner in a prison, you're still a consumer. And I think people forget that. They're either an end user, or they're within the chain themselves, or the part of distribution, or the part of movement, and their entire cycle works upon it. And for those of us that either have been in governance, or are in governance, or in a part of governance or compliance within a regulated sector, I think that we need to look a little bit deeper at what we're doing and how we're affecting through our actions, and especially for the regulators themselves, the economy. And that's what I posit within this, is that I talk about, I do it in real layman's terms, because it's this paper is an executive summary essentially. It's posited towards CEOs and CFOs, so that they can get an almost instant view of what their organisation, even any organisation, looks like in a lynch point. Even if you're doing fintech, reg tech, any type of tech whatsoever, you're not working in the digital space. You're working with physical materials. You're working with a computer. You're working with chips within that computer. You're working with a whole load of different elements, minerals, composites, etc., that, as Lakshmi stated just then, have come from various regions that could be or may be under sanctions, or could be maybe within a certain nefarious chain, or could be maybe providing materials or labour, where you've got a human labour problem and a forced human labour problem, or a smuggling problem, or anything within that chain. And I think people do forget that. And so I talk about that within this paper, that, page 1 basically focuses on, look, everything that you use, the computers that we're speaking over now, whether it be a phone, whether it be a laptop, iPad, or a PC itself, it's physical. The components of it have got to come from the supply chain process. The electric that we use to power them comes from a supply chain process. The wires come from a supply chain process, and all the financial elements of that, for all those little minute components and parts, could be within a problematic tierage of supply chain problems. So when you're looking at the movement of money, and for those of us that are on this call from kind of that compliance background, look at businesses and think about trade, and think about CTF, and think about AML. But what is being focused on at top level at the moment is the sanctionable elements of it. And then, say, within Singapore, with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, we're looking at something that came in about 2 years ago, which was the Environmental Risk Management Guidelines, which are very thorough indeed. And they've just put some information papers out this year about how well regulated entities are doing with that. So the banks, the asset managers, the insurers that they put it out for. And unfortunately, it wasn't too positive. But the banks and the insurers and the asset managers weren't set up in capability to look at these matters, because they were trying to tick a box for the AML matters. So that holistic piece wasn't in the framework. The greater look at, right, okay, who am I serving? Who are my vendors? Who are my clients? Who's utilising my facilities? Where is my money passing through as an organisation? And where are the vendors and clients' monies passing through as their organisation as well? And where are their activities taking place? And those questions over the past 5 years really have just started to be being asked in certain locations. Certain locations were very quick off the mark in certain jurisdictions because of their legislative framework, their policing framework, their organisational governance framework, because of the holistic nature of it. And then some jurisdictions just still are not in that framework because of the culture around it. It's fair. We live in a world. We don't live in one isolated country. We're not living in a complete world totalitarian regime here. We're working with roughly, depending on your geopolitical view, 250 countries. So in that, Are we then trying to gain a complete view in governance of what's going on globally? Because supply chains work globally. Supply chains, the processes of them within the supply chains are roughly the same. You've got a start and you've got an end. You've got an end consumer. But that end consumer then might sell it on to somebody else. So there's that question as well. But essentially, the supply chain is the same. It goes from one to another to another to another. And that's what this speaks about. It speaks about kind of enhanced traceability and due diligence processes through governance. So say in Singapore, we've got the STP Plus program for organizations that can get certified to import items quicker into the country if they go through a very diligent exercise for their vendors, for their HR, for their transportation, etc. So they can quickly and easily move goods from A to B and then back to C again. So if they want to value add, say in Singapore, and then push it back out the door again, it can be turned around very quickly. If they don't go through that process, it's a slower process, and hence time is money. It's the same, but actually a little bit more thorough than CTPAT in the US. So it's about secure transfer of trade, essentially, and there's loads of security protocols placed about that. So that ESG level is focused within that portfolio as well, with then, like say, the MAS process kicking in for financial institutions at the other end of governance, where the money's flowing through. And then you've got a filtration at the moment, last year, I think, this year with the European Securities and Markets Authority, which is more about trading bonds, leverages, trade transfer, assets, derivatives, that form of process. So everything's starting to compound at the moment, and this paper essentially deals with that and other elements. There's other elements within it, aside from obviously the ESG, the starting portfolio, and then dealing with the chip part of it, which technology at the moment, everybody wants to get to technology, but actually, look, it's physical assets. Stop thinking of it as digital assets. These are physical things with physical labor, with physical money moving from A to B to C to D to E before it gets into a digital framework. Because when you're looking at somebody who's digging up silica, those guys aren't getting paid in digital cash, if they're getting paid at all, that is. Right. But the fact is this is about labor. It's about real hard graft, and it's about physical product. So when people speak about digital, they're speaking, if you will, in terms that aren't realistic, because digital only gets to the far end. It's only at the far side. It's the same with the digital asset market at the moment. Digital assets wouldn't be in place if there was no physical product in the first place to come to it, or no physical end to it. A digital asset has to have an outcome at the end. You know, if it wants to gain, and you want to buy a house, a Ferrari, a car, which is, we're not in lawnmower man mode yet. So at the end of the day, it's all about physicality, and that's what I talk about in this. I talk about this is your daily business, this is your daily grind, and especially for CEOs that need to look at that bigger picture. What's going to come into the future? What are the future thoughts? Where's compliance going down? Where's due diligence going down? And what are the big geopolitical organizations looking at? What are the UN looking at? What is FATF looking at? Interpol, Europol, and then all the organizations such as one that Lakshmi works for, NGOs, etc.
Fantastic. Also, Mark, if you could, if you have the link to that report handy, maybe you can put it in chat. So,
I will. Yeah, most definitely. And it's not just me talking in it. It's highly referenced at the back as well. But it's the former police officer in me. I'm a bit litigious. So yes, I'll put that in. Thank you very much.
Great. So Lakshmi, in the area of trade in particular, so are you seeing the outcome of these disruptions in supply chains leading actually to a significant, increase in money laundering, or I would say, an incremental increase over what normally happens, or terrorist financing risks. You spoke a bit about all these regulatory changes a few minutes back. So are there any examples as well that you can share with us of any specific typologies that have come up in the last few months and that you've noticed?
No, absolutely. And, I often wish the answer was a simple one in these cases, but the truth is it isn't. Correlation doesn't always equal causation. And so there are, I think, several different examples that have emerged, and they talk about, different trends. I think the one thing, the big thing in the room that we all can't get away from is the sort of knock-on effects from what's happening in Russia and Ukraine. And I think the first thing that we're seeing that is that, the sanctions regime around it is primarily concentrated in, for the lack of a better expression, in mostly Western countries. You have large blocks of the world that, apart from sort of, the UN level sanctions, the individual country sanctions are things that are not as sacrosanct, and the way to get around it is not using the US dollar. And so sort of the immediate reaction to what we're seeing is now, a lot of the way AML architecture and the need for strict AML controls that we see is because, it ties back to correspondent accounts. It's then that relationship governs it. So once you start moving away and you're starting to use alternate currencies, then it immediately shifts the nature of enforcement. So now you're starting to ask the question, will China have that kind of enforcement? Will, if it ever uses a situation where you're talking about the Russian ruble and, through that, you see some movements, will that have enforcement? Because you're shifting the levers around enforcement. Will we see an ICICI case on the other side of the equation in China? And I think those, are a little unclear, given especially the attitude maybe to sort of corruption and money laundering and enforcement around those issues, depending on where you are in the world. And so I think that's something that I think is worth highlighting. Now, in addition to that, just in terms of impact, it's complicated. In some ways, we are seeing no impact. For instance, the very strenuous sanction programs around Russian oil have not worked. Russian oil is still being sold. It's been sort of a boon for the Indian and Chinese market. Arguably, we've only seen really a reduction of about less than 3%. Russian oil production was around 310,000 barrels per day. It was only below 310,000 barrels per day. And, exports were only down by about 580,000 barrels per day. So we still see that, like in the case of Russia, they're able to either, commingle the oil elsewhere. They're able to just make direct sales to the tune of about $21 billion. Now, in other areas, I think there are more interesting developments that we're able to see. Now, for instance, again, as a reaction to this, we have seen the development of new trade corridors. The the trade corridor between Iran, India, and Russia was essentially a defunct trade corridor, even though it existed, because there were other more convenient corridors. And what's emerged as a reaction is now the utilization of this. Now, the consequence of that is that once you have these new trade corridors, and this is just a reality no matter where you go in the world, illicit activity migrates where licit activity goes. That's just, how business is done. If there is good business to be done someplace, bad business will follow good business, because all the benefits that come with good business is also what bad business wants. Bad business wants trade facilitation. Bad business wants easier access. So all those things are absolutely true. One of the things we often see is that goods that are particularly need to be expedited. So fruits that are easily can be decomposed, and we've seen this especially through the EU-China thing. We've seen a lot of drug cartels will place drugs through it because it is lower rates of inspection, because there's an expediency tied to it. Similarly, other things that we've seen as a reaction to this is, because of how much of the sanctions environment, and there's been such a curb on the goods that can go into Russia, we've seen a culture of parallel imports that the Russian customs agency itself acknowledges. And the bulk of those imports are coming from Asian countries and the Asian market. So in many ways, it's a boon to Asian countries, Asian markets, but you also see an uptick as a consequence of counterfeit trades. The other, the developments we have seen again, both as a consequence, but long-term developments are, for example, like, and I think this is true of now, but can also really be transposed to at a later point, or really any kind of developments, is that, for instance, like you saw the NATO-run logistics supply chain that was going through Afghanistan. From Afghanistan, it went to Uzbekistan. Now, any supply chain or logistics or transportation network, that whole has to go through a country where you have high rent-seeking behavior from political elites. It means that any future transport corridor there is then just a money-making opportunity. And in the instance of, like, for example, like with the NATO, you really saw that about 30% of costs along the transportation corridor were you're just making facilitation payments. And facilitation payments is a very nice way of saying you have to bribe someone. And that's what the costs are going to, and that's what we're really seeing as a reaction to sort of what the geopolitics is happening. You can see sort of transport corridors moving across Central Asia, and anything that's being developed across Central Asia, which is Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. There is a higher rent-seeking climate that does take place. In other ways, what we are also seeing is also the increase in wildlife trafficking. And this is not to say that it is purposeful. There is no government agenda to say that, oh, I'm trying to do this. But what we're also seeing is that all the problems that we already have in terms of enforcing supply chain due diligence, enforcing trade-based money laundering, are exacerbated because you're building new trade corridors, you're transforming supply chains given the crisis, but you don't necessarily see the same level of development, both in terms of the priority that this often takes place with financial institutions. And I say that, I don't mean to say that as a blanket statement. It is of course true depending on the context where you are, but very often for the source destinations, for example, when you talk about wildlife trafficking, whether it's Africa or parts of Southeast Asia, things aren't getting better there. You aren't seeing such a, you see to a degree some improvements. The Chinese government has started doing like Mekong River patrols and all of that. But by and large, the infrastructure is not. You don't have strong data exchange mechanisms. Customs departments aren't doing that. So you're dealing very often with like legacy tools, but you have infrastructure developing at a faster rate than that. And so those problems remain unchanged for that reason. So yes, it's not a good answer, but the truthful answer is it's a mixed bag. And, I think if there's an opportunity later to talk about regulatory developments, I can certainly point to sort of certain heightened regulatory developments, especially on the US side of things, and the absence of the same in other countries. But I'll hand it back over to you, Shirish.
Thanks, Lakshmi, for that very, very comprehensive answer. And I think you mentioned ICSA a couple of times. I think one of our participants has actually posted a link to that story in chat. So all of you in the audience who want to know more about that can actually take a look at that in the chat box. So thanks, Rahul Banerjee, for posting that link. Mark, so now, Lakshmi spoke about all these sorts of different types of crimes and typologies and, things happening. So, from governments and regulators, what kind of policy responses would you expect, right? Is there anything you've seen that has happened recently, that stands out?
So I'll come on to that in a moment, but something that Lakshmi commented upon in relation to oil is interesting because people make the assumption or some people that aren't within our space make the assumption that sanctions are just this wonderful thing that kind of kills the activity. It doesn't, and you just have to look at something like a controlled substance, a narcotic, a drug, where that market in itself is worth billions in USD. The criminal markets just for that particular portfolio of criminality is worth billions, and it consistently moves. These are items that mostly throughout the 250 are illegitimate and shouldn't be within the community. Lakshmi spoke about facilitation payments, quite right. It does happen very often. And so if we can't stop or unwilling to stop controlled substances, or say the movement of firearms, which is another billion-dollar industry in terms of illegitimate firearms, then what chance is there that sanctions will work for legitimate products such as oil? That is oil, unless it's tested. You can derive where the oil comes from. At the moment, there's a lot of transshipping in the high seas, where the oil is mixed up anyway with other oil from other locations, and then shipped around, and then transshipped again, and then shipped around and goes to a consumer destination, or a destination where it's reported and then split down into different oil containers, etc., within the port itself, with no kind of mention of Russia or any of the other locations that might be commoditizing in that way. So when we've got this, my whole question in relation to sanctions, full stop, not just the supply chain as a whole, is how effective can they really be to the kleptocracy, for example, or the leaders, or the governance of the country that's supposed to be nefarious? Because if you take something like the Iraq sanctions from the Iraq war many years ago, 2003 onwards to 2014, for example, the damage wasn't done in terms of the sanctions to the individuals in governance. They typically went somewhere else, found somewhere to refugee in. It was done to the citizens of that country. And the citizens of that country then wanted, through legal processes, to sue for reparations, because the majority of them were in such a situation that, starvation was occurring. There was matters of ill health and degradation, etc., and the community completely fried itself. So sanctions as a whole might be good on paper as a tool, but does it really do the correct job? The problem is for us as governance, or for financial institutions, is that it's a must. It's got to be done, because otherwise you cannot operate, or you're in a legitimate circumstance with the organisation that's completed the sanctions, or even a tertiary party. The type of matters that I'd like to see is some more honest conversations about how economy can work throughout the world at that United Nations stage, how countries can succeed and profit with the citizens that they've got in that country, and then the regulations are targeted, as they should be, because there is targeted sanctions towards the individuals that are causing the most problems. And that's the real way. The problem is that you've got kind of multilateral sanctions, or a kind of sanction that affects the whole framework, the whole country, or the responding countries around that, or certain institutions or organisations. So the majority of the effect of the current sanctions, for example, is having a trickle-down effect and a direct effect on the citizens of Russia, for example. You've got these people in Russia, because of the top level, should they be affected? I understand why it's occurring and happening from a geopolitical point of view. But are we going to have the same crisis there and have to mop up that crisis? And who is going to actually mop that crisis up? Because it's the biggest country in the world. So how do you then go about mopping that process up if all these sanctions and all these geopolitical processes then kick into gear and actually work in the way that other countries, the sanctioning countries, want them to work? What is going to be the fallout of that? And economy-wise, corporate-wise, from kind of my standpoint, being within a corporate enterprise, is that the supply chain must work. Corporates need to work because individuals need to be paid within those corporate entities. Because if not, then you've got a situation in other countries, especially multinational corporations, where the system breaks down, where multinational corporations then have to reduce staff, reduce costs, reduce output, reduce purchase, etc. The profit and loss sheet won't work out. So you still need the movement of goods to deliver upon the promises that you've made as either a manufacturer or a vendor or whatever it may be that your industry does. And if you need that raw material from countries that can only provide that. Obviously, the licenses and exclusions to sanctions, as there are at the moment, even in China, from the US. But those things need to work right, and I think regulators need to actually deal with the detail. And something that Singapore have done right is these environmental risk management guidelines, because it's doing it in a way that the financial institutions then really have to look at who their clients are and who their clients' clients are, in terms of natural resource processes and what the supply chain is and looks like. It's a better kind of softer way of doing it, but it's got a real process, because then you can't transact if you're acting or part of a bad actor process.
Right. Lakshmi, would you like to quickly comment on policy responses? Are there any particular actions that you're seeing by policymakers that stand out?
No, absolutely. And I realize we are running short on time as well. So I will keep my answer brief. So I think the one thing I think is interesting is, like, I've seen the most aggressive policy responses on the US side, again, because the US is leading a lot of this effort, and it is particularly worried about how its efforts may be undermined in the ongoing geopolitical crisis. So the one thing we've seen very clearly is that the US Customs and Border Protection has asked importers to produce supply chain maps, which identifies entity, worker information, including pay, audit reports, which show the kind of working conditions. And a lot of this is as a reaction to the forced labor in Uyghur camps. And so, the Unfair Labor Practice Act was passed in the US, and this is a reaction to that. Secondly, we've also seen, like, the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, is now expecting companies to treat compliance that involves sanctions as a boardroom level issue. So it's not just a compliance team issue. It wants the board of the company to weigh in. And the idea being that if there are failures, then there is individual and companies will be accountable, because they are the ones that are responsible for furthering geopolitical objectives. So the failure to do so, it will be a direct indictment on them. Now, at the same time, and this is important from a regulatory side, is as we see this severe curtailing, we've also seen countries that are willing to play both sides. So, there is this wide extension of diplomatic efforts. You see a lot of money pouring into Latin America, Asia, Africa. And so as a regulatory approach, you therefore see governments willing to play both sides. As we've seen in India, the ability to switch into the renminbi. All of those are also reactions. So we've both seen, like, a real tightening and curtailing, but also loosening. And it really depends on where you are and what your geopolitical relationship is to the ongoing situation and how you can best maneuver around that. But I'll stop there.
Right. So, Lakshmi, sort of carrying on that point, and as it would relate to our audience today, which are mainly regulators and banks and the financial sector, broadly what we call reporting entities. Now, obviously regulators are facing some challenges, in responding to, trade disruptions. But, how do you think banks can actually build mitigation strategies to sort of combat, all these risks and make sure that their AML program is fine-tuned to counter this?
No, absolutely. And I think the one thing is to have sort of price sensitive tools that essentially you're looking at the prices to see, okay, does it make sense as goods move from country A to country B? So these, price risk tools essentially tell you that, okay, for this commodity, does it make sense? Because no financial institution is expected to be an expert in every product and market segment. And so, tools exist to do that. Now, and beyond that, those are, they are paid to, they are paid tools. And, I think a financial institution is to sort of understand what its customer risk profile looks like, the same A to ABCs of understanding it, which is, but to think about it from the trade context, to say, okay, does it make sense? This is the regions in which we really trade. This is the kind of, if we are giving loans, and with the understanding that, financial institutions and banks don't always give loans or have credit finance documents to support the kind of transactions. But where there is, you can make an assessment of, okay, this is the industries we support, these are the sectors we support, this is how we can fine tune tools to actually work towards it. And where it isn't, I think, price tools are incredibly valuable, but there are also more specific sort of disaggregated tools disaggregated trade records you see that can be also used. And we are slowly moving towards greater automation, the ability to sort of make sure that, your invoice records and the records that are presented at multiple stages of a trade transaction are synced. And I think, all those things can get you closer. They are not a surefire solution. But the one thing I would, which is over and above this, that I will ask everyone to keep in mind, a lot of the reasons we still don't have, there is so much opacity, is because there is continues to be a massive financing gap. The Asian Development Bank estimated to be over $8 trillion, and that's not getting any better. And so trying to find ways to plug the financing gap means that you also get more coverage and you have a better sense, because if you provide financing, then you have greater insight into the transaction. So thinking about it, not just from sort of the risk assessment tools, but thinking about the larger trade financing issue and how to plug that and how to make sure there's increased financing is another way to, I think, have better insight into how trade works and therefore supply chain risk management as a whole. So, yeah.
Right. Mark, following on to what Lakshmi said, you've got a very strong policing as well as, risk management, as well as a tech background. So, what do you think banks should be doing, to specifically leverage technology, for their mitigation strategies? If you can throw some light on that.
Getting the wallets out, mainly, I think will be a good idea. It's, financial institutions have been criticised in full in relation, and a lot of the time people forget that financial institutions are profit-making entities. They think that it's just some government building somewhere that you chuck your money into. It's a private, in a lot of countries, the majority of countries, it's a private organisation that's there to make money. It's a profit-making centre. What's happened in recent years, and it is recent, let's face it, 30 years, 40 years, depending on which jurisdiction you're in, it is recent. You've then got these nasty regulations that come about where organisations have got to tick a box to make sure that they retain their licensing country, i.e. regulate law, regulation, trickle-down effect, etc. Some countries led the way, some countries followed, some countries enhanced from following as well, and the countries that started it have dribbled off a little bit. So financial institutions in the main are complex organisations that typically are still working off a mainframe system from the 70s and 80s. Trying to then get a due diligence portfolio piece that interacts with that, with complex machine learning capability, which is what essentially Pathak and others are talking about, to interweave into financial systems that were built in the 70s and 80s is an absolutely huge undertaking. The majority of organisations are still on the SWIFT network. It's still the number one network to be on. We're still working off messaging systems on the SWIFT network. And as a result of that, how can then these super duper systems, the ones that like the type of data and the integrate knowledge graphs and AI and machine learning and things, how can we then assist? We've then got to come into an organisation, review what the organisation looks like, have a real bent to the technology that the organisation has, and then how that's going to work internally to be able to put data into them that they both need and require to assist them to continue on their due diligence journey. Or alternatively, they can continue to tick the box, which in some countries that's fine, in some countries they're being pushed not to do that. Now, we've also got to bear in mind that a lot of organisations, banking organisations that are seen as multinational organisations actually operate franchises, if you will, if you want to look at it in that way, in certain jurisdictions. So it might be that X bank is not really X bank within that jurisdiction and just copes with it in that way. what we've got to look at then as well is its business portfolio, who it's dealing with and for what purpose and what the clients are. We still need to realise that at the top level between, say, the US and China, there's still a chip war going on. So silicon chips, etc., machine learning chips. So in China, for example, the government have got kind of the ultimate public-private partnership, if you will. So Ant Financial and a government in certain jurisdictions within those state-owned enterprises is currently reviewing credit cities. And those credit cities basically review an entirety of an individual's portfolio of how they are. It's a behaviour process system. It's a good governance. It's not a good governance system, but it's supposed to be a good governance system for individuals within that jurisdiction. And that's what's going on at the moment, is that there's a lot of kind of artificial intelligence, machine learning capability, warfare that's going on between countries. And that automatically impacts upon the major tech firms, the major manufacturing firms, the major supply chain firms, if you will, that a lot of these financial institutions are dealing with, and the regulators have then got to look at. That's why, at geopolitical level, cyber's on the menu, chips are on the menu, supply chains on the menu, and due diligence, ultimate beneficial ownership's on the menu. So it's a case of the organisations, financial institutions really need to look at how can we integrate this data, because Thomson Reuters, I've never seen data like it. You know, we own so much, but it's about understanding how that can be integrated with a financial institution. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. I think we are almost at the end of time. I can't see any audience questions so far. So until maybe I'll wait for a few seconds for that to come in. And until then, let me just make a quick announcement. This is about the 40.3 freedom race. This is to empower survivors of trafficking and slavery. This is currently in process. I think many of you know Robin Lee from Napier, who's also supporting this initiative. We're putting in a link in the chat box that if any of you would like to support the 40.3 freedom race, please contact Robin Lee from Napier. We've put his email ID there in the chat box. That will also help to raise awareness about slavery and trafficking. All right, so I think we are at the end of our session. I have to really thank Lakshmi profusely, because I think it's almost midnight there, I'm guessing, and it's going to become Friday now. I think it's Thursday night, right, Lakshmi? And
yes.
finally, you will be, attending Fridays with Fintelekt on a Friday, not on a Thursday. And thanks to Mark as well, because he's just come off a long flight to Australia and just checked in. So sort of photo finish, made it in time. So thanks, Mark, for doing that. And audience, thank you so much for joining us. Our next episode of Fridays with Fintelekt will happen on the 11th of November at the same time. And at that time, we will have Maria Nizero from the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, who will join us to talk about her latest research paper. So with that, Lakshmi and Mark, thank you so much for your time, effort, and for sharing your thoughts with the audience.
Thank you very much, and thanks for listening to my very tired, addled wittering. And Lakshmi, thanks for being my partner on this little journey today.
No, thank you so much. And, everyone else, happy Friday. And I hope everyone has a great weekend. Thank you. Good night. And thank you both, Mark and Shirish. It's always wonderful to be a part of anything Fintelekt does.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Fintelekt.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you.
Bye then.
Bye.